She lived in sin for 9 years. She was the mistress of a wealthy nobleman. She had a child out of wedlock. And then one day, she found his murdered body in a forest. That moment shattered her world and launched one of the most dramatic conversions in church history. This is the story of Saint Margaret of Cortona, the woman they called the Second Magdalene. Margaret came into the world in Liviano, a small village clinging to the slopes of the Val di Chiana, where her father Tancredi eked out a living as a farmer. The soil was hard, the work harder, and the rewards meager. Her mother's name has been lost to history, a fitting erasure for a woman of her class and time, but we know she loved her daughter fiercely in those early years. Margaret would later speak of her mother's tenderness, the way she would sing while grinding grain, the warmth of her embrace on winter nights when the wind howled through the gaps in their walls. The child was beautiful. Even in that rough cottage, even with dirt under her fingernails and her hair tangled from play, there was something luminous about her. Neighbors noticed it. Her mother noticed it, and perhaps worried, for beauty in a poor girl was as much curse as blessing. Margaret had the kind of face that made people stop and stare, the kind of grace in her movements that seemed incongruous with her ragged clothes and bare feet. She was 7 years old when her mother died. The illness came quickly, a fever that burned through her in less than a week. One day Margaret's mother was kneading bread with strong hands. The next she was lying on a straw pallet, her skin hot enough to scald. Margaret knelt beside her, holding her mother's hand, watching the light fade from eyes that had only ever looked at her with love. When the end came, the little girl did not cry. She simply sat there, still holding that cooling hand, until her father pulled her away. Tancredi remarried within the year. He was a practical man, and he needed a woman to run the household, to cook and clean and help with the endless labor of keeping body and soul together. The woman he chose, again, history has not preserved her name, was practical too. She looked at Margaret and saw another mouth to feed, a stepdaughter whose beauty would eventually require a dowry they could not afford. She looked at this child who still sometimes wept for her dead mother, and she felt no softness. The change in Margaret's life was immediate and brutal. Where before she had been cherished, now she was tolerated. Where before she had been held, now she was put to work. Her stepmother was not overtly cruel. She did not beat the child or starve her. But there was a coldness in the house now, an absence of affection that gnawed at Margaret's spirit like hunger. She would rise before dawn to fetch water from the well, her small hands red and chapped from the cold. She would spend her days helping in the fields, watching her father speak gently to his new wife while barely looking at his daughter. She would lie awake at night, listening to sounds of a household where she was no longer truly welcome, and she would remember her mother's songs. The girl who had once been joyful became withdrawn. She sought refuge in the hills, wandering among the olive groves where she could be alone with her thoughts and her grief. And it was in this loneliness, this hunger for love and belonging, that the seeds of her future were planted. Margaret began to notice how people looked at her, how men's eyes followed her as she walked through the village, how her blossoming beauty seemed to be the only thing about her that anyone valued. By the time she was 16, Margaret had grown into a young woman of extraordinary loveliness. Her face had lost its childish roundness, revealing elegant bones and eyes that seemed to hold both sadness and light. Her figure had ripened into womanhood, and she moved with an unconscious grace that made heads turn. In a different life, with a different family, she might have made an advantageous marriage. But she had no dowry, no prospects, and a stepmother who made it clear that Margaret's presence in the house was a burden. It was during the harvest festival of 1263 that she first saw him. He rode into Liviano at the head of a small retinue, a nobleman from the nearby town of Montepulciano. Some chronicles call him Arsenio, though the name may be invented, a placeholder for a man whose real identity was carefully obscured by history. What we know is this. He was young, perhaps in his mid-20s, with the confidence of a man born to wealth and position. He was handsome in the way of those who have never wanted for anything, well-fed, well-dressed, moving through the world as if it existed for his pleasure. And when he saw Margaret standing by the well, her arms full of the late summer flowers that grew wild in the fields, he decided that he wanted her. She noticed him watching her. How could she not? He made no attempt to hide his interest. While other villagers quickly looked away from the nobleman's gaze, Margaret met his eyes and felt something kindle in her chest, a dangerous warmth, a flutter of possibility. Here was someone who looked at her the way her mother once had, as if she mattered, as if she was precious. That the look was not one of maternal love but of desire was a distinction her lonely heart was too starved to make. He began to court her, if such a word can be used for what transpired. He would ride to Livorno and seek her out, bringing her small gifts, ribbons for her hair, sweets from the market, a silver brooch that she hid from her stepmother. He spoke to her of the world beyond their village, of music and fine clothes and days without backbreaking labor. He told her she was beautiful, that she deserved better than this hardscrabble life, that he could give her everything. Margaret was not naive. She understood what he was offering. He never spoke of marriage, never suggested that she could be his wife. A nobleman did not marry a peasant girl with no dowry and a dead mother. But he could take her as his mistress, set her up in comfort, give her a life of ease. And Margaret, at 16, with a stepmother who barely tolerated her presence and a father who had learned to look away, found herself tempted by a proposition that would damn her in the eyes of the church and society. She tried to resist. She knelt in the village church, cold and dark, and prayed to the Virgin Mary for strength. But when she returned to her father's house, to her stepmother's cold looks and the endless grind of labor, the nobleman's promises sang in her ears like a siren's call. He wanted her. He would care for her. Wasn't that a kind of love? When she finally said yes, when she agreed to leave Livorno and go with him to his castle, she told herself it was a choice born of necessity. But even then, even as she packed her few belongings and prepared to leave the only home she had ever known, she must have felt the first stirrings of shame. She was giving herself to a man outside the bonds of marriage. She was choosing comfort over virtue. And though she could not yet see it, she was stepping onto a path that would lead her into darkness before she could find the light. The castle at Montepulciano was nothing like Margaret had imagined. In her fantasies, born from her lover's honeyed words, she had pictured soaring halls and elegant chambers, a life of refined leisure. The reality was a fortified manor house, comfortable enough by peasant standards but far from palatial. Stone walls that sweated dampness in winter. Rushes on the floors that grew musty and had to be changed. Servants who looked at her with thinly veiled contempt, knowing exactly what she was, a kept woman, a nobleman's plaything, a girl who had sold herself for comfort. But there were compensations. For the first time in years, Margaret did not go to bed hungry. She had dresses of fine wool, dyed in colors she had only glimpsed before in the clothes of wealthy merchants' wives. She had soft bread and meat at table. She had a bed with actual linens, not just a straw pallet on a dirt floor. And she had him, her lover, whose name she whispered in the dark, whose arms provided a warmth she had been starved for since her mother's death. The shame came later, creeping in like cold through cracks in a wall. At first, Margaret pushed it away. She told herself that this was simply how the world worked. Noblemen took mistresses. Always had, always would. She told herself that what she and her lover shared was real affection, perhaps even love. He was kind to her, mostly. He gave her gifts. He seemed genuinely pleased by her presence. When he was away on business or hunting, he would return and seek her out immediately, and in those moments, she felt wanted in a way she had not felt since her mother died. She gave birth to their son in the spring of 1264, less than a year after leaving Livorno. The labor was long and terrible, and there was no proper midwife. just a servant woman who had delivered babies before and knew enough to keep Margaret from dying. When they finally placed the infant in her arms, red-faced and squalling, Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. This tiny creature, this boy with his father's strong nose and her own dark eyes, was completely dependent on her. Completely innocent and completely illegitimate. They baptized him in the castle chapel, a rushed and almost furtive affair. There was no celebration, no gathering of family and friends. The child had no legitimate claim to his father's name or inheritance. He would grow up as she had, without a mother, in a sense, for what kind of mother was she? A sinner who had borne a child in sin, who was living in open defiance of God's law and the church's teaching. The boy needed her, though. So Margaret settled into her role as mother and mistress, and tried not to think too much about the life she had left behind or the life she might have had. She loved her son with a fierce protectiveness that sometimes frightened her with its intensity. She would hold him while he slept, studying his small face, and feel a complex tangle of emotions, joy and terror, love and guilt, hope and shame all knotted together in her heart. The people of Montepulciano knew what she was. When she ventured into the town market, she could feel their stares, could hear the whispers that followed in her wake. Women would pull their daughters closer as she passed, as if her sin might be contagious. Priests would look at her with expressions of mingled pity and disapproval. Once, an old woman spat at her feet and hissed, "Harlot," and Margaret had hurried away, her face burning, her son clutched to her chest. She stopped going to Mass. How could she? She was living in mortal sin, sleeping with a man who was not her husband, bearing his illegitimate child. To present herself at the altar, to kneel among the virtuous wives and unmarried maidens, would be the height of hypocrisy. Better to stay away, to avoid the accusing eyes and the whispered judgments. But avoiding the church did not silence the voice in her own heart. Margaret began to have dreams. In them, she would see her mother's face, sad and disappointed, turning away from her. She would see herself standing before Christ in judgment, and when he looked at her, his eyes held such sorrow that she would wake weeping. She started to hear sermons in her mind, remembered fragments from her childhood when her mother would take her to the village church. "Flee fornication," St. Paul had written. "Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit?" Her body had become a different kind of temple now, a shrine to earthly pleasure, to the comfort and security that came at the price of her immortal soul. Years passed this way. 1 year became 2, then 5, then 9. Her son grew from infant to child, bright and affectionate, blissfully unaware of the shadow that hung over his birth. Her lover showed no signs of tiring of her, but neither did he make any move to legitimize their union. Margaret was now 25 years old, no longer a naive girl, but a woman who had spent nearly a third of her life in sin, and the weight of it was beginning to crush her. She began to experience what she would later describe as divine visitations, not visions exactly, but powerful interior movements of the soul. While hanging laundry, she would suddenly be overwhelmed with a sense of God's presence, so real and so reproachful that she would have to steady herself against a wall. While watching her son play, she would feel an aching awareness that she was teaching him, by her very life, that sin was acceptable, that God's laws could be ignored when they proved inconvenient. The conflict within her intensified. Part of her wanted to flee, to grab her son and run, to seek some way back to grace. But where would she go? She had no money of her own, no family that would welcome her back, no skills beyond those of a peasant farmer. She was trapped by her circumstances, by her dependence on her lover, by the terrible inertia of years of sin. And then came that autumn morning in 1273. Her lover had left 2 days earlier for a hunting expedition in the forest. This was not unusual. He often went hunting, sometimes for days at a time. But this time, something felt different. Margaret could not shake a feeling of unease, a prickling sensation at the base of her neck. His dog, which he had left behind, began to act strangely. The animal would not eat, would not settle, would pace the halls whimpering. On the third morning, the dog came to Margaret while she was breaking her fast and began to pull at her skirts with its teeth, something it had never done before. She tried to push it away, but it persisted, barking and pulling, until finally she understood. The animal wanted her to follow it. She called to a servant, told him to watch her son, and followed the frantic dog out of the castle. It ran ahead of her, looking back periodically to ensure she was following, leading her down the path toward the forest where her lover had gone hunting. Margaret's heart began to pound. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. The dog led her deep into the woods, farther than she had ever ventured, to a place where the trees grew thick and the underbrush tangled. And there, in a clearing, covered with branches and leaves in a crude attempt at concealment, she found him. Her lover's body lay broken and still, his throat cut, his fine hunting clothes stained dark with dried blood. His face was gray, his eyes half open and filmed over. He had been dead for days, murdered, robbed, and left like refuse in the forest. Margaret fell to her knees beside him. A sound came out of her throat, something between a scream and a sob, something animal and anguished. The man who had been her entire world for 9 years, the father of her child, the source of her comfort and her damnation, was gone. Just gone. The flesh she had caressed was cold meat now. The lips that had kissed her were slack and bloodless. She knelt there in the dirt and the dead leaves, and something broke inside her. Not just her heart, though that shattered too. Something deeper. The illusion she had been living under, that this life could continue indefinitely, that there would always be time to repent later, that somehow everything would work out, cracked and fell away, and she saw herself clearly for the first time in 9 years. She was a sinner. She had thrown away her virtue for comfort and security, and now both were gone. She had a son with no father, no name, no future. She had a soul stained black with sin. She had wasted years, precious years, in a life that had led nowhere but to this moment, kneeling in a forest beside a corpse, with nothing and no one and nowhere to go. God have mercy, she whispered. God have mercy on me, a sinner. The words, from the publican's prayer in the gospel, came unbidden to her lips. She said them again and again, rocking back and forth beside the body, while the dog sat nearby and whined. God have mercy on me, a sinner. God have mercy on me, a sinner. When she finally stood, her decision was made. She could not undo the past 9 years. She could not restore her lost innocence or erase her son's illegitimate birth. But she could choose here and now to change. She could turn away from sin and toward God, no matter the cost. She arranged for her lover's body to be recovered and buried. She gathered her son, now 9 years old, and told him they were leaving. And then, with nothing but the clothes on their backs, Margaret of Liviano began the long walk back to the village of her birth, to beg her father's forgiveness and to find some way to save her soul. The road from Montepulciano to Liviano had never seemed so long. Margaret walked with her son's small hand in hers, each step a kind of penance, each mile a journey not just through the Tuscan hills, but through the landscape of her own shame. She had left this path 9 years ago as a beautiful girl with nothing to lose. She returned as a woman with everything to atone for, leading a fatherless child toward an uncertain future. Her son, whom she had named after his father, asked questions she could not answer. Where are we going, Mama? Why did we leave the castle? When is Papa coming back? She told him they were going to visit his grandfather, that his father had gone to heaven, that everything would be all right. The lies tasted like ashes in her mouth, but how could she explain to a 9-year-old boy that his mother was a sinner seeking redemption, that his father had never been her husband, that the life they had known was built on sand? When they finally crested the hill overlooking Liviano, Margaret stopped. The village looked smaller than she remembered, the houses more shabby, the fields more meager. Had it always been this poor, or had 9 years of relative comfort changed her eyes? She took a deep breath and continued down the slope, past the well where she had first caught her lover's eye, past the church where she had prayed as a child, toward the cottage where her father still lived. Tancredi was in the field when she arrived, bent over his hoe, his back more curved than she remembered, his hair gone completely gray. Margaret stood at the edge of his property and called out to him, "Father?" He looked up, squinted against the sun, and his face went through a series of transformations, confusion, recognition, shock, and then something that might have been joy. He dropped his hoe and started toward her, arms outstretched. For a moment, Margaret thought it would be all right, that she would fall into her father's embrace and be forgiven, that coming home had been the right choice. Then her stepmother emerged from the cottage. The woman was older now, her face more lined, but her expression was the same cold assessment Margaret remembered from her childhood. She took in the scene at a glance. The prodigal daughter returned, a bastard child in tow, clearly destitute. Her mouth became a thin line. "No," the stepmother said. Just that one word, but it stopped Tancredi in his tracks. She made her choice. She left to live in sin, to become a rich man's whore. She cannot come back here and bring shame on this house. "She's my daughter," Tancredi began, but his wife cut him off. "She was your daughter. Now she's a harlot with a bastard. Do you want the whole village talking about us? Do you want them saying we harbor sinners? We have our own children to think of, our own reputations. Send her away." Margaret watched her father's face, watched him look between his wife and his daughter, watched the weakness win. He had always been a weak man, she realized. He had let her mother work herself to death. He had remarried too quickly. He had barely noticed when his new wife made young Margaret's life miserable. And now, when his daughter came to him in desperate need, he chose the easier path. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he said, and his voice broke. "I cannot. You must go." She should have expected this. Some part of her had known it would end this way. But the rejection still hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over with pain. Her own father, her only living blood relative, was turning her away. She had nowhere to go. No family, no money, no prospects. Just herself and her child and the crushing weight of her sins. Her father looked at the ground. The Franciscans in Cortona. They help people. They might take you in. Cortona, a town she had never visited, friars she had never met, charity she did not deserve. But what choice did she have? Margaret gathered her son, who had been watching this exchange with wide, frightened eyes, and turned away from her father's house. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her but closed doors and dead love. If there was any hope for her at all, it lay ahead, in the unknown. The journey to Cortona took 2 days. They slept rough, huddled together in a barn where a kind farmer let them stay in exchange for Margaret's help with the milking. She had not done such work in years, and her hands, softened by 9 years of ease, blistered and bled. Good, she thought. Let them bleed. It was a small pain compared to what she deserved. As they walked, Margaret prayed. Not the rote prayers of her childhood, but desperate, heartfelt pleading. "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Mary, Mother of God, intercede for me. I am a sinner. I am lost. Please, please show me the way." And something began to happen. Later, she would struggle to describe it, but there on the road to Cortona, stumbling along with her exhausted child, Margaret began to experience the presence of God with an intensity that left her breathless. It was as if a veil had been torn, and she could suddenly sense the divine reality that undergirded all of creation. She felt her sins as actual weights, crushing darkness that pressed down on her soul. And beneath that darkness, almost unbearable in its beauty, she felt the love of God, vast, incomprehensible, waiting for her to turn fully toward it. "I will change," she whispered. "I will give up everything. Just show me how to make this right." They arrived in Cortona as the sun was setting, two dusty travelers with nowhere to go. Margaret made her way to the Franciscan church, her son trailing behind her, and found a friar locking up for the evening. He was an older man, his brown habit worn and patched, his face kind. "Please," Margaret said, and her voice cracked. "I am a sinner. I need help." The friar, whose name was Fra Giunta, looked at this young woman with her haunted eyes and her frightened child, and something in his expression softened. "Come," he said. "Let us talk." She told him everything. The whole sordid story poured out of her, her mother's death, her stepmother's coldness, her lover, her years of sin, the murdered body in the forest, her father's rejection. She hid nothing, spared herself nothing. When she finished, she was weeping so hard she could barely breathe, and her son was clinging to her skirts in terror. Fra Giunta sat quietly for a long moment. Then he said, "God's mercy is infinite. There is no sin he cannot forgive if the sinner truly repents. But repentance is not just words, child. It is a complete turning away from sin, a total reordering of one's life. Are you prepared for that?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Whatever it takes. I will do anything." The friar arranged for her to stay with a group of pious women known as the Poverine, the little poor ones, who lived a semi-religious life in Cortona. They were shocked when Fra Giunta brought them this beautiful woman and her illegitimate child, but they agreed to take her in. Margaret would work for her keep, they said, and begin a life of penance. The next morning, Margaret rose before dawn and walked to the cathedral. She stood at the entrance, this woman who had not set foot in a church in 9 years, and she was seized with terror. How could she enter? How could she defile this holy place with her presence? But she forced herself forward, step by step, until she was kneeling before the altar. And then, in a voice loud enough for everyone in the church to hear, she began to confess her sins publicly. "I am Margaret of Liviano," she cried out. "I am a sinner. For 9 years I lived as a concubine, bearing a child outside of marriage, offending God with every breath. I beg your prayers, good people of Cortona. I beg God's mercy. I am wretched. I am lost, and I throw myself on the divine compassion." The people in the church stared at her in shock. Some were scandalized. Others were moved. But all of them saw something rare, a sinner who made no excuses, who sought no justification, who simply acknowledged the truth of what she was and begged for grace. She made her confession to Fra Giunta, and it took hours. Every sin, every moment of pleasure stolen from God, every time she had chosen comfort over righteousness, she confessed it all. When she finished, the friar gave her absolution, and Margaret felt something she had not felt in 9 years. Peace. But peace did not mean the struggle was over. It meant the real battle had just begun. Margaret threw herself into a life of such severe penance that it frightened even the Franciscan friars. She slept on the ground with a stone for a pillow. She fasted until her body became skeletal. She wore a rough hair shirt that rubbed her skin raw. She begged for alms in the streets, and when people mocked her or threw refuse at her, she thanked them, saying she deserved worse. The devil did not take this lying down. Margaret began to experience temptations of an almost overwhelming intensity. In her sleep, she would dream of her dead lover, feel his arms around her, hear his voice whispering that she could have it all back if she just gave up this madness. She would wake gasping, her body betraying her with desire, and she would throw herself on the floor and pray until the temptation passed. Other times, the attacks were more direct. She would see demonic visions, hideous faces leering at her, voices telling her she was damned anyway, so why bother, that God could never forgive someone as filthy as her. Once, She felt invisible hands trying to choke her, and she clutched her crucifix and screamed the name of Jesus until the pressure released. But there were also visions of a different kind. Christ began to appear to her, not in dreams, but in her waking hours, sometimes visible, sometimes a presence she could feel more surely than she could feel her own heartbeat. He would speak to her in words that seemed to bypass her ears and go straight to her soul. "Daughter," he said to her one day as she knelt in prayer, "I have chosen you for my own. Do not be afraid." Margaret wept at these words. Chosen? Her? The sinner? The harlot? The woman who had wasted years in fornication? It seemed impossible. Yet she felt the truth of it burning in her heart. The Franciscans, watching her transformation, began to see something extraordinary. This was not just a penitent sinner. This was a soul being radically remade by divine grace. After 3 years of probation, 3 years of watching Margaret's unwavering commitment to her new life, they accepted her into the Third Order of Saint Francis as a tertiary. Margaret took vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. She would never marry, never own anything, never again choose her own will over God's. And for the first time since her mother's death, she felt like she had found her true home. The years that followed Margaret's entry into the Third Order of Saint Francis were marked by a spiritual intensity that would have broken a lesser soul. She was now nearly 30 years old, her beauty ravaged by fasting and penance, her body weakened by the austerities she imposed upon herself. But her spirit blazed with a fire that drew people to her even as it frightened them. Her son presented a painful dilemma. The boy was now 12 years old enough to understand that his mother had become someone different, someone he barely recognized. Margaret loved him with a mother's fierce devotion, but she also knew that her new life of radical poverty and penance was no life for a child. After much prayer and many tears, she made the agonizing decision to send him to be educated by the Franciscan friars, who would raise him in the faith and give him opportunities she could never provide. The day she said goodbye to him, Margaret felt as though her heart was being torn from her chest. This boy, her only child, the living reminder of her sin, but also the person she loved most in the world, she was giving him up for God. "You must become a better man than your father was," she told him, holding his face in her hands. "You must serve Christ with your whole life. Promise me." The boy, confused and hurt by this mother who seemed to love God more than she loved him, promised. He would later become a Franciscan friar himself, but Margaret would not live to see it. Alone now, truly alone for the first time since his birth, Margaret threw herself even more completely into her spiritual life. She moved into a cell, barely more than a closet, attached to the Church of San Francesco. The space was so small she could barely lie down, with a single window that looked out onto the street. Here she would spend hours, sometimes entire days, in prayer. Her visions intensified. Christ appeared to her regularly now, sometimes in glory, sometimes as the suffering man on the cross, sometimes as a tender lover wooing her soul. These were not gentle, comforting experiences. They were violent, overwhelming encounters that left her physically exhausted and spiritually transformed. One night, as she knelt in prayer, Christ appeared to her carrying his cross. The weight of it seemed to crush him, and Margaret could see every detail, the splinters digging into his shoulder, the blood running down his face from the crown of thorns, the way his legs trembled under the burden. "Help me carry it," he said to her, and suddenly Margaret felt the weight of that cross on her own shoulders. The physical pain was excruciating, but worse was the spiritual anguish. She felt, in that moment, the weight of all human sin, including her own, and it was unbearable. She collapsed on the floor of her cell, weeping and gasping, and when the vision ended hours later, she found that her shoulder was bruised and bleeding as if she had actually carried a physical weight. The Franciscan friars, particularly Fra Giunta, who had become her spiritual director, carefully documented these experiences. They were skeptical at first. Visions could be products of an overwrought imagination or even demonic deception. But as they watched Margaret's life, saw her grow in humility and charity, saw the fruits of her mystical experiences manifest in concrete acts of love, they began to believe that God was truly working in her in an extraordinary way. Margaret developed a particular devotion to the Eucharist. She would spend hours before the Blessed Sacrament, often entering into ecstasies that left her unconscious to the world around her. People would find her in the church, kneeling before the altar, her face radiant, tears streaming down her cheeks, completely unaware of their presence. On several occasions, witnesses reported seeing her levitate during these ecstatic prayer experiences, her body rising several inches off the ground, held aloft by some invisible force. But Margaret was not content to live a purely contemplative life. Her mystical experiences drove her outward, toward the suffering and the poor. She began to work among the sick, particularly those with the most repulsive diseases that others refused to touch. Lepers, people with gangrenous wounds, those dying of plague. These became her special charges. There was one woman in particular, a leper whose condition was so advanced that the smell of her rotting flesh was unbearable. No one would go near her. She lived in isolation outside the town walls, slowly dying in agony and loneliness. Margaret heard about her and immediately went to find her. The stench hit Margaret long before she saw the woman, the sweet, sickening smell of decaying tissue. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn back, to run. But she forced herself forward, step by step, until she was kneeling beside this human being whom society had discarded. "I have come to care for you," Margaret said. The woman's face, what remained of it, showed disbelief.
"Why?
"Why would you touch someone like me?" "Because Christ is in you," Margaret said simply. And she meant it. When she looked at this suffering woman, she saw Jesus on the cross, Jesus in his passion, Jesus who had said, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me." She cleaned the woman's wounds, changed her bandages, brought her food and water. The work made her physically ill. She would often have to step outside to vomit before returning to continue. But she persisted, day after day, until the woman died in her arms, clean and comforted, and no longer alone. News of Margaret's sanctity began to spread. People came to her for spiritual counsel, for prayers, for help. She developed a reputation as someone who could see into souls, who knew people's hidden sins and secret sufferings. A wealthy merchant came to her once, boasting about his charitable donations, seeking her praise. Margaret looked at him steadily and said, "Why do you tell me about the bread you give with your right hand when you hide the bread you steal with your left?" The man went pale and fled, but later returned to make a full confession and restitution for his dishonest business practices. Her relationship with Christ continued to deepen in ways that defied ordinary description. He spoke to her constantly, giving her messages for others, revealing to her the state of souls, showing her visions of heaven and hell and purgatory. She saw souls in torment, souls in bliss, the intricate justice and mercy of God's judgment. These visions were so vivid, so real, that ordinary life seemed pale and insubstantial by comparison. "I have made you my bride," Christ told her in one vision, and Margaret felt herself being drawn into a mystical union with the divine that transcended anything earthly marriage could offer. She was his, completely his, and she belonged to no one and nothing else. The years she had wasted in sin now seemed like a distant nightmare, replaced by this overwhelming reality of divine love. But the spiritual life is never without its battles. Margaret continued to experience fierce temptations, particularly regarding her past sins. The devil would appear to her, showing her visions of her dead lover, reminding her of the pleasures she had renounced, whispering that she was a fool to have given up comfort and security for this life of poverty and suffering. Sometimes the temptations were so intense that she would beat herself with chains, trying to drive out the sinful thoughts with physical pain. Christ reassured her during these trials. "Do not be afraid," he told her. "These temptations cannot harm you if you do not consent to them. You are mine, and I will never let you go." She also founded a community of women who wanted to follow her example, the Ladies of Mercy, they were called, though they were also known as the Poverelle. These were women who had chosen to live in poverty and devote themselves to caring for the sick and poor. Margaret trained them, shaped them, poured into them everything she had learned about sacrificial love. The community would outlive her by centuries, a living testament to her vision of radical charity. In her final years, Margaret's health began to fail. The years of extreme fasting and penance had taken their toll on her body. She developed painful tumors, suffered from what was probably cancer, and experienced episodes of excruciating pain. But even in her suffering, she maintained her prayer life and her work among the poor. "How can I rest," she would say, "when Christ is still suffering in his members?" She spent her last days in her tiny cell, surrounded by her spiritual daughters and the Franciscan friars who had guided her journey. Her son, now a young friar himself, came to her bedside. The reunion was bittersweet. She barely recognized this man who had once been her little boy, and he struggled to reconcile the emaciated, dying mystic before him with memories of the mother who had once held him. On February 22nd, 1297, as dawn broke over Cortona, Margaret of Cortona died. She was 50 years old. Her last words were simple: "I have sinned, Lord. Have mercy on me." And then, according to those present, her face transformed. The lines of pain and age seemed to smooth away, replaced by an expression of such joy and peace that everyone in the room knew. They knew she was seeing the face of God. The woman who had lived as a sinner for 9 years, who had spent the last 27 years of her life in radical penance and mystical union with Christ, had finally come home. Her body was placed in the Church of San Francesco, and almost immediately, miracles began to occur. The sick were healed at her tomb, the possessed were freed, sinners were converted. The people of Cortona, who had once scorned her as a beautiful harlot, now venerated her as a saint. Margaret of Cortona was formally canonized in 1728, more than 4 centuries after her death, but in the hearts of the faithful, she had been a saint from the moment she knelt in that forest beside her murdered lover and cried out to God for mercy. Her story remains a testament to the transformative power of grace, proof that no sinner is beyond redemption, no past too dark for God's light to penetrate. She had been lost, and she had been found. She had been dead, and she had been brought to life. And in the end, the prostitute became a saint, the sinner became a bride of Christ, and the woman who had once sold herself for comfort discovered that the only true comfort comes from complete surrender to divine love.